This self-reflexive critique, notes Althusser, places Lacan in the strange position of revealing that authority is a bluff, yet a bluff that's somehow still taken seriously. Lacan was thus playing a double game. To philosophers, he brought the guarantee of the master who was supposed to know what Freud thought. To psychoanalysts, he brought the guarantee of the master who was supposed to know what thinking philosophically means. He duped everybody, and quite plausibly, despite his extreme trickiness, he duped himself as well. It is too straightforward, therefore, to say that Lacan is a charlatan and nothing more. The self-reflexive way he reveals that he is imitating the voice of the master makes him not just a charlatan, but a meta-charlatan. Lacan is ultimately a fraudulent master whose duplicity is enacted not for the sake of tricking us, but in order to open our eyes to the fact that authority is always a deceit that only succeeds when we fall for the would-be master's bluff.
The very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is the whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is a typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins. As always, we are sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we introduce today's guest, consider throwing us $1 a month at www.patreon.com/MUHH. And we're excited to have on Peter D. Mathews, whose recent book, Lacan The Charlatan, has been published in the Palgrave Lacan Series last year. And Peter, how are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you guys?
We're excited. I'm excited.
This is how we're spending our Saturday night. We're spending our Saturday night with you and your Sunday morning, which is interesting.
My Sunday morning. Yeah.
You're talking to us from Hong Kong, is that right?
From
Korea,
Seoul.
Right?
Seoul. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you for having me on, guys. I really appreciate the interest in my work. I'm looking forward to talking to you some more about it.
Like we were kind of saying in the pre-show, I'm more of the Lacan fanboy, and it's sort of, I would say, I don't think he's necessarily the best analyst or philosopher, but as far as a pure thinker, I think is where he shines. And I find the creativity in his presentation and his work to be just extremely compelling. So obviously this was like the perfect book for me to read. I'm like your target audience. The way the book is, it's not necessarily biography. It's sort of this, you're weaving a nice little kind of mixture of some of the theoretical points. You're picking up some critique, and then, with a little bit of biographical detail, perhaps touched on here and there to fill in the blanks.
The book itself is like autobiographical in one sense that this is Lacan, as I mentioned at the beginning of the book, was kind of a thinker that I was briefly sort of obsessed with in my time as a student, and then sort of felt I had outgrown, but I had a sabbatical from middle of 2016 to 2017, and I wanted to write a book. And the idea that kept on coming back to me after all those years was I wanted to explore a kind of the idea that I took from Seminar 11 of the subject who is supposed to know, of this idea of mutual misunderstanding, right? Basically that basically when the two subjects look at each other, they kind of project their imaginary version of what they imagine the other to be like. And that was sort of like, that was the beginning of the book. And actually, I wrote this book twice. I wrote it the first time around, and I finished the draft. It took me a year to write the damn thing. And then I read it through, and I was like, no, I need to read a whole lot more. And I just spent the next couple of years just reading like a madman. I read well over 100 books just as background for what I was doing here. So this is actually like version 2 of this book, because I wasn't happy with the first version.
Now, did you have the same structure in mind in that first draft of going through each thinker who has the similar refrain of labeling Lacan as a charlatan and a quack? Or did that come in 2.0?
That came in the second version. Yeah, the first version, I was focusing more upon Lacan and the seminars and the écrits, those writings about how this idea of mastery is a kind of fraudulent kind of idea. So all that, those ideas, obviously, they got reworked into the second version. But then as I was doing all that background reading, I was sort of, as we were talking about in the pre-show, one of the things that really puzzled me about the critics of Lacan was the way in which they seemed to refuse to engage in a genuine critique, right? So you had a lot of thinkers, a lot of very well-known figures, like Chomsky and so on, like Sokol and Brickman, like Dylan Evans, coming out and saying Lacan is a charlatan, right? He's just a clever wordsmith. He dazzled everyone on the French scene with his flashy ideas and his skill with words, but there is no substance there. And it seemed to me that was kind of a way of avoiding critique, right? Dismissing Lacan, but while avoiding critique. And so I wanted to go through, and it seemed to me there was a lot I could do there with looking at the different aspects of the ways in which these thinkers said that Lacan's a charlatan. So Raymond Talus, for example, gave me a chance to look, for my own benefit too, to look really in depth at the way in which Lacan's linguistic theories, for example, changed and evolved. When I was studying Lacan in university, of course, that sort of like the structuralist/post-structuralist Lacan was the one that was really emphasized, right? So as well as the mirror stage essay, of course. Those ideas about the signifier and the world is made up of signs and all those kinds of things, that was what was foregrounded. And so looking at Talus and his argument, and then looking at the way in which Lacan's ideas change and evolve across the seminars, right? And how he moves away from that sort of structuralist set of ideas and sort of like makes that sort of like dramatic break that some of the thinkers, I'm sure we'll talk about later on, like Tomsic and Cordela, talk about the way in which, and Kopiec as well, talk about how Seminar 17 is so transitional for the way in which he sort of collapses the opposition between the symbolic and the real.
I think this is great. And you brought up Raymond Talus, whom I've never heard of, and I'm not sure if he's well known. One of the things that seemed to come out when looking at his work as you portray it and reading, I read his little Wikipedia article and didn't really learn too much there, but it does seem like he has a thorn in his side that he tried to save, American university discourse from the French, from the French thinkers, the French invasion. And he seems to bemoan his lot in being ignored or being, well, first of all, since this is your second chapter in the book, Lacan, the linguistic charlatan, right? And I suppose Raymond Talus believed that his 1988 work, Not So Sure, was a humorous title for his book. But this gets into his, as you see it, is his argument that Saussure shouldn't be taken seriously at all, and therefore that undermines many of the French thinkers? Or is it Lacan's specific use of Saussure that he seems to conflate the two? Because as you pointed out, and I didn't know this until reading your book, it's not really until the 50s that Lacan is taking seriously structuralist linguistics. And then it's later that he seems to jettison those ideas.
I think probably, well, for me, in rethinking this particular aspect, a couple of thinkers were particularly important. One was probably the book that I looked up to most while writing this book was David Macy's book, Lacan in Context, which was published in 1988, but remains just like a really amazing critical evaluation of Lacan. He's, on the one hand, he's well-versed in Lacan, and he really knows Lacan's ideas, but he's very willing in that book to point out the limitations of what Lacan is doing. And he has a fantastic chapter in that book about the way in which basically he says that Lacan's claim to being a linguist is basically bullshit, right? That he's playing sort of linguistic games and he's interested in language, but Lacan can have absolutely no claim to being a linguist. And this is quite a forceful thing to say from someone like Macy. And so there is, of course, the limitations of what he's doing in terms of linguistics, but then, of course, he's still doing some interesting things with getting us to think about language. And then, of course, the other person that really helps to place this in perspective is Zizek. Because Zizek is one of those people who did the opposite of what most people have done with Lacan, which is that people are usually introduced to the early to middle Lacan. Right. Where we see that the structuralism, especially from the Rome discourse, is highlighted is really foregrounded as being like the groundbreaking part of Lacan. Whereas Zizek reads Lacan through the later Lacan, and sort of like goes back, and I show it in the book where there's a collection on Lacan and language or something like that.
Right.
And like Zizek is invited to write a chapter in this, and he like starts out the chapter very, following basically the first paragraph of the book says, this is what the book is about, and so I'm following this particular topic. And then he's like, but I'm going to throw all that out, and I'm going to talk about how all of that is an incorrect reading of Lacan and how Lacan moved away from all that.
It seems a little ballsy, right, to do that.
Yeah. It really is fascinating to see how from that Seminar 17, that's why I said the other person is John Kopiec, who in Read My Desire talks about how when Lacan goes to meet with the radical students at Vincennes. Have you guys read that famous, there's like a transcript of their meeting. It's included in the translation of Seminar 17.
I should have grabbed that because I briefly recall some of the highlights.
It's amazing. I think it's also included in the translation of television as well. They include it as a supplement there. And basically it's this meeting that Lacan is invited to meet with these radical students at the Vincennes University, which of course is the radical university that they founded after the events of May 68. And like all the students there are like these radical Marxists, and they're really hostile to him. And, Lacan comes in and he like starts writing the 4 formula that he has he's developing for Seminar 17 up on the board. And they're all like, what are you doing? Like, this isn't radical. This isn't revolutionary. This is just more structuralism. And he famously tells them, like, you are looking for a master and you don't realize it, and you're going to get one, right? But what Kopiec does really well in her reporting of this particular incident is the way in which she shows that while on the surface these 4 discourses look like nothing new. They look like just a more fancy version of Lacan's earlier sort of mathemes or formula from the Rome Report. Actually, they are a collapsing of that distance between the real and the symbolic. And this is where sort of like, for me, people like Deleuze come to this idea through Spinoza, right? Through this idea of a kind of monism, right? Where you can't separate the symbolic from the real. They're not 2 separate things. And I think this is sort of Lacan's moment as well, where through the 4 discourses, he shows that there is always this relationship between the symbolic and the real, and that these 4 discourses are basically four positions related to how those 2 things interact with each other, but really they are part of the same thing.
That was one of the threads that I really enjoyed throughout the work, is the centrality of the 4 discourses and how they recur and help to ballast your arguments about authority, about mastery and self-mastery. And I guess with Talus, as you point out, one of the flaws of his arguments, not the whole, but one of them, seems to be that he wants to, one of the most famous essays is I always mess up the title of it. What the entrance of the eye into the mirror stage essay, right? This was, which was written in 36. But your point is that this doesn't hold water. If you're going to attack Lacan on his use of Saussure and structural linguistics, if you've only read the mirror stage, that doesn't really seem like you've done your homework, because as you point out, he hadn't even begun reading the general course in linguistics. He hadn't really had that encounter until almost 15, 20 years later.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit like, criticizing Marx having only read the Communist Manifesto or Nietzsche for only having read The Birth of Tragedy. It's like you can do it, right? You can criticize those works, but you always have to criticize them with the understanding that their work continues to develop and change as their career unfolds. So you can't just, latch onto an early work and say that this is everything that is about them. And especially because, of course, Lacan, as I talk about in that chapter, he's quite clearly struggling with the same ideas that Talus is identifying. Like he sort of like comes to realize the extent to which his structuralism is a kind of linguistic idealism. And even Merleau-Ponty kind of says this to him. And so, as I said, I think if you read the seminars in like sort of chronological order, you can see him struggling to sort of solve that problem, and that finally Seminar 17 seems to be the not the final solution, because of course he goes off onto his mathemes and knots and all sorts of other crazy things. But certainly it's the break that occurs that sort of like at least solves the linguistic side of things. Yeah.
Yeah, I like that you point out one of the charges Talus makes is about linguistic idealism. And you have the quote where Lacan says, if idealism is nothing but thoughts, then place me with the realists. It's kind of like perhaps how sometimes the Derrida quote, nothing outside the text, gets hyperbolically taken out of context.
Yes.
Is it similar to something like that?
I think it's very similar to that. Yeah. Although I have a little less sympathy for Derrida and making that particular formula, but yeah, you're right, and I think it's also partly because Lacan has a fairly sort of unconventional way of interpreting and understanding a lot of these thinkers. I mean, like I talked about in the following chapter about like Descartes and mathematics, and sort of like his reading of Descartes is very unconventional. Right. He's not, we don't usually just think of him in this way of like, basically he says the Enlightenment project was founded by Descartes and is about doubt. Right. So that he then like sort of metatextually applies this to Descartes, that Descartes is doubting Descartes, when Descartes never does doubt Descartes, right? He never does, but he applies that sort of logic to him. I think he does that a lot with a lot of thinkers where he reads them in this sort of idiosyncratic sort of way, and then people like Talus might come along and read him in a more conventional sort of way and be like, "Oh, that's not at all how it is," right? But
is this what you take away from Nancy and Lacan, where it's about this diversion of thinkers that kind of get subsumed into Lacan's framework? It's maybe what Deleuze would call buggery, right? Where you're sort of giving a monstrous child to each thinker, but they can't really disclaim them. Yeah,
I really love that the Lacan and Nancy book. It's a fantastic read, and I think it was the first book on like real. I mean, I know Lemaire is considered to be the very first like academic work on Lacan, but their work is the first sort of genuine attempt to critique Lacan, and it's really mostly just their very Derridean sort of conclusion where they kind of misunderstand, I think, deliberately maybe misread his conclusion. But I think their analysis of his, I don't know if you call it dishonest, but his very, how would you say, convenient misreading, right? So that Augustine can be, like a 20th century, like Caesarean linguist, it's kind of amusing the way in which he's able to place all of these different thinkers, and they all like somehow Freudian and somehow Caesarean and somehow fit into like the discourse that he is talking about, without having to take into account, of course, the very radical sort of historical differences that separate them from what he's doing. It's very clever. I don't think it's necessarily like a terribly honest, but
it's not necessarily as malicious as some of these other accusers, like Talus.
Right, I think so. Yeah, I think Nancy and Lacan also come across to that sort of like position as well. They are kind of admiring of what he's doing in that sort of sense. They never sort of like, well, he's just a malicious thinker and we should dismiss him, right? They do sort of like repeatedly say the extent to which like that we should still engage with his ideas and engage with his work. And like, as I said, this is what I asked for from the critics of Lacan, right? Is that they make a genuine attempt to critique his ideas. And I think Nancy and Lacan are one example of that. Paul Jakobson is another. Roustan, the subject of the final chapter, is another. And those group of thinkers, they retain some sort of like integrity in the way in which they sort of like attempt to look at the limits of what Lacan is doing. Whereas some of the other thinkers like Talus, I mean, by the time, I know when I was researching this project, there were a number of translations of Lacan that I had never read, including Seminar 17, actually, because that had only relatively recently been published. It wasn't available when I was a student. But there appears to be no wider reading involved in his project. There's just one quote from the Rome Report and commentary on the Mirror Stage.
Right.
And so that's very thin for someone who published 30 years of had 30 years of seminars, Acre, and there's also some other fantastic little additions to, I don't know if you've seen them along the way, like Talking to Brick Walls and stuff like that have come out since as well.
Would you ascribe to Talus something that I know I forget the author you quote, but this will be the subject of the next chapter on Lacan, the mathematical charlatan, and Sokal and Brigmont and their take on Lacan. But would you ascribe the same idea that perhaps Talus doesn't do the legwork because he can't or doesn't have the theoretical toolbox to engage Lacan on his ground, and so it's much easier to sort of do a sort of free-for-all polemical attack based on the flimsiest of understandings of Saussurean linguistics?
Well, I don't know if you looked up Talus's background, but he's not a literary theorist or theorist in any way. He's
geriatric doctor?
Geriatric medicine, yeah. That's his background. So, I mean, it's not just his reading of Lacan that's very thin on the ground. Like when you look at his readings of Derrida and Foucault, Roland Barthes, they all he just like read a very small selection of these thinkers, and he seems to have a kind of he has a bee in his bonnet about the rise of sort of French theory. But if you also read what he talks more generally about, he has this very sort of narrow idea of what literature should also be.
Right. Okay.
So for instance, like he really hates more sort of like experimental sort of postmodern fiction. So he dismisses out of hand, for example, Iris Murdoch's The Sea, right, as being just like nonsense, it's rubbish, right? He basically says. So it's not just a distaste for theory itself, it's also he has this very strong sort of reaction against postmodern fiction as well, that is part of this sort of kind of almost reactionary kind of mindset that he's putting together here. It's really hard to tell how much of it is like sort of attached to a politics, because it doesn't seem to be like articulated directly as a kind of, you know, necessarily like, oh, he's a conservative in that sort of sense. But that's basically where it takes you, in that sort of direction. And
it seems like he's doing the very thing that Lacan overcomes or performs the alpha bung of, which is this, at the end of the day, it seems like he is performing mastery without being aware of it, without showing us the trick. He's trying to just dismiss from some sort of purported authoritative position. I'm not sure where, you know, just from the reactionary stance itself being the moral high ground, so to speak. For me, this is one of the sort of like the key things at stake in the book is this idea of mastery. And I gave several definitions of it. But for me, mastery overall, especially in how Lacan is describing it, is something that I wrote it down so I could say it exactly in the words I wanted to say. The discourse of mastery as the unilateral imposition of one's own desire. So basically, I believe this, I think this, therefore this is how it is. Right. And so you impose this on the world, upon others, upon life. And that this is a discourse with, of course, a long history in human culture, whether it is in theology, right? Mm-hmm. So famously, God's speech to Job, right? Yes.
Where he basically says, you know, I'm God, you're Job, so shut up, bitch. You know, like, you made the world, I did. So
I love that when Job finally gets to the point where he has the breakdown and says and asks why, you know, why all this bad stuff? Because he keeps hearing that, oh, you obviously did something wrong, right? Yeah. And I think that's and you do bring this up in the book, this Job moment, and I mean that's perfectly articulates the Master Discourse, correct? Right. God to Job, but he basically says, I don't have to give you a reason. Mm-hmm. Right. That's one of the key things I think is important here in understanding about the Master's Discourse is the master, what the privilege of the master is that he or she doesn't have to give a reason for what they're doing. They can just unilaterally impose their beliefs and their ideas as to what is reality upon others. So I talk about this also a bit in the Descartes section, where I talk about how the discourse of the university discourse and the discourse of knowledge undermine that, because if you have a true Master's Discourse where God can say 2 + 2 = 5, right, then the master is still imposing on reality. But, you know, things like logic and so on show us, of course, no one is going to respect that kind of master in modern society. And of course, the other example of that kind of sort of authoritarian, you must believe what I say, of course, comes to us in the form of monarchy, right? And especially absolutism and the divine right of kings. And so I think a lot of
what I'm interested in with Lacan is the way in which he's actually addressing how do we get beyond that kind of mastery, right? How, of course, we don't want to have kings. We don't want to have a monarchy. We don't want to have absolute rule. But then what do you put in its place that doesn't become a new master discourse? And so that's why I find the stuff, I know I talk about it in the Schneiderman chapter, where I talk about how Lacan goes back to his reading of the 18th century. This leads Lacan to think about in Seminar 7, the twin figures of Kant and Sade. What is very interesting to him about them, especially as an analyst who is thinking about neurosis and stuff like that, is the way in which the more we've had access to pleasure, the lower the barriers, the less pleasure we seem to be able to feel. Not because people have stopped us from having pleasure, but because of the structural way in which pleasure seems to work. Those are all very fascinating to me because of the way in which they are wrapped up in this sort of there's obviously the French Revolution and that Kant and Sade are responding to is a revolution supposedly outwardly against mastery, against the king, against monarchy, but secretly it kind of allows a new, more insidious kind of mastery that then Lacan again identifies, for instance, from May 1968 as being again entering by the back door, this new, more insidious, hidden kind of mastery.
Your definition that you had of the Masters Discourse as this unilateral imposition of my desire onto others, is it something like that?
I'll read it again. The discourse of mastery as unilateral imposition of one's desire on others.
Okay, that foreshadows, as you already pointed out, Seminar 7, but specifically this argument about utilitarianism that arises after the French Revolution, and that it gets entwined with this discourse about usefulness and rationality, and therefore if
utility,
pleasure utility. Therefore, if jouissance or pleasure is if enjoyment is useless, it therefore cannot be rational, and then therefore cannot be pleasure, right? We'll return to that. The next chapter is about Lacan, the mathematical charlatan. And this one I mentioned earlier, but this might be the one most familiar to a more general audience,
right? Because
it details the thinkers. And this chapter has to do with Sokal and Bricmont and their book Fashionable Nonsense, which I didn't know in French. The original title is Intellectual Impostures. So I think either title is actually good and gets to the heart of it. I mentioned to you too in the break that I had read this mostly looking for what they say about Deleuze and Guattari. But do you want to say for the audience, maybe sketch out some of the general outlines of the so-called, not to pun, Sokal hoax and sort of lead us into their discussion of Lacan as you work through it in this chapter?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a number of aspects to this particular chapter that I look at. Obviously, they begin with looking at the superficial nature extremely superficial nature of what Sokal and Bricmont do. I'm certainly not the first to address this. I talk about, as you mentioned in the break, Bruce Fink, also does quite a detailed rebuttal of how Lacan is not meaning these psychoanalytic formula as being mathematical formula, that they are meant in a quite different context and that they therefore have quite a different meaning. So he's borrowing some notation, but he's using it in a totally different way. It brought me to a couple of other things because, first of all, the Sokal and Bricmont, basically, they claim a consensus amongst Lacanian critics about the use of the mathemes, and they sort of say that Lacan's followers all follow the mathemes as if they are God-given scripture by the master. And, this is kind of a contrast in a sense to what we see in the chapter on Talus, because there is quite a decent sort of consensus, especially amongst the sort of the latest Lacanians, so those who've been influenced by the readings of Zizek and Macy and Kopiak and so on, that there is a complexity to what Lacan is doing that goes far beyond the sort of the Saussurean, Levi-Straussian understanding of his linguistics. So there's already a complexity, but also quite a consensus with regard to Lacan's use of language and the signifier. But this ridiculous claim that they make about the consensus amongst Lacan's so-called disciples about the mathemes being this new brilliant language is quite not substantiated at all when I looked at the different critics who are talking about what the math themes actually mean. So some of them say like it's just nonsense. Some of them say it is. Some of them, a small minority, say they are useful for understanding his concepts. Others talk about you can see them as him trying to do something, but that he doesn't really follow through on it. So like on page 75, like I gave in the footnotes, I gave like four quotations, one from Francois Roustan, one from David Macy, one from Jane Gallup, and one from Malcolm Bowie, right? And they all have, these are all famous Lacanian scholars, and they all have totally different takes on what the math themes are for and what they're doing and how to read them and understand them. So for me, this is just like one very sort of brazen example of the way in which Sokal and Brickman don't even have the basics down. They only vaguely talk about who these disciples are. They obviously haven't read any of the surrounding literature. They obviously don't know what Lacan is actually doing, if anyone does know what he's doing with the math themes. And so, as I talk about that section, that was not done. Derrida's famous statement about them was that basically they didn't do the work. They didn't do they didn't engage the critique. They just sort of elided it by pointing to some passages, as you said, from the passage from Guattari that you read was similar, right? They just, this doesn't mean anything, therefore it's nonsense, which is basically, I don't understand it, therefore no one can, right?
Yes,
very sort of arrogant sort of idea. So, I mean, obviously I looked at some sort of key examples of this, but one of the things that I wanted to do differently in my chapter, first of all, was I wanted to look not so much at the targeted critiques, right? The critiques of particular thinkers like Lacan, Guattari, etc., Kristeva, that are famously highlighted, but they have two chapters in the book, right, that sort of are more about their own takes and their own theories about what they are doing in fashionable nonsense or intellectual impostures. So it's very interesting to me to see the way in which they claim to be defending the Enlightenment. This is Sokal and Brickman's central claim. They're sort of like, we are defending the Enlightenment. But then when I came to try to figure out, well, which Enlightenment, like which thinkers are they standing up for? I couldn't really find any. like they're definitely not Spinozists. They're not Cartesians, right? They're not Voltairians. They're not Rousseauists. Who are they standing up for? And it seems to me this is a really very dubious version of the Enlightenment. Basically, they don't like anything that is too sort of self-reflexive in the way in which it critiques rationality and it critiques what they're doing in terms of science. And of course, this, as I said, this is not the Enlightenment then. You can't include any actual Enlightenment figures if you don't include a sort of a radical skepticism about the self and about the world in that, because that, of course, is, to me anyways, the core of what the Enlightenment is doing, right?
Yeah, I mean, all of this is very interesting. One of the Zizek quotes that you bring out in this chapter is him discussing Kant's famous influential essay, What is Enlightenment? Or what is that the title? Or I might be confused. Yeah. Foucault also has an essay named that, but he makes the point, right, that it's argue all you want, but obey. That's kind of what Zizek boils it down to, correct? And it seems like perhaps that is this then one of the key figures of the university discourse? And perhaps this is what Sokal and Brickman are using as their sort of shield, saying we're neutral observers. We don't have a dog in this fight.
This is for your own good.
Yeah, this is for your own good.
We're warning you for your own good.
Right, yes. Right.
This is like junk food, basically.
That's
effectively. That's really kind of yeah, right. That's a nice little metaphor. If you'll.
They don't say that they're neutral. They say that they are traditional left-wing thinkers, traditional left-wing humanists who fear that the progressive cause is being led astray by this kind of like anti-intellectual nonsense as they see it.
You do point to their preface where they kind of say like, hey, we're not against philosophy or against, I don't know if they call it the human sciences or the humanities in general. We're just against certain thinkers whose charlatanry can lead people astray, correct?
Right.
Maybe instead of being neutral, it's specifically the supposed neutrality of objective knowledge,
right?
Correct? Like, as you point out, and I forget again which theorist who says this that you quote, but it's not only does their book mainly amount to a series of somewhat interesting footnotes insofar as what they're calling out for each thinker really doesn't have any bigger implications to said thinker given the proper context. But it also seems like their book would have never come out if they didn't have their social status as scientists.
Yes, well, it's actually a critic, Goshgarian, who says that about the interesting footnotes, not me. Can't take credit for that. But yeah, I mean, that's the thing, is like a lot of the energy and the prestige that allowed them to publish this book was based upon a kind of discourse of mastery, not a discourse of critique, and that they actually had something genuinely critical to say. And so, I mean, I also talked about like some of the reviews for the book. So like Talus's review, for instance, Richard Dawkins, they also clearly are advocating a kind of position of mastery for science, which of course is precisely what science is supposed to be against, right?
Yeah, right.
So
that's very Lacanian sort of critique too.
Right. It's like what I was saying a little bit earlier about the French Revolution, was that it was supposed to be against hierarchy, monarchy, mastery, all those sorts of discourses, but through the back door, it allows them to return. And here we see like these scientists using science in the same way. I really wish I had an opportunity to talk about, there's a section of Fashionable Nonsense, I don't know if you remember it, where they talk about criminology, right? And
no, I don't remember that. Yeah.
Oh, it's great, because they talk about how criminologists are basically scientists, and criminologists use science to catch criminals. And I really wanted to talk about this in relation to Lacan's analysis of the Purloined Letter, where he shows how the police think like scientists and they're unable to catch the criminal precisely for that reason. Because
that's so good.
That's a great point.
I didn't get a chance to talk about that, but like I really wanted to put that in the book. But it seems like, I talk about I make an allusion there on page 89 that like Sokol and Brickman they kind of use the same strategy as Socrates, right? They say like, I'm the reasonable one, right? I don't use just rhetoric, right? I don't just use wordplay. I don't use just tricks. I use logic, right? And it's those nasty sophists who are the ones who are playing word tricks and misleading people. And they very cleverly reappropriate this rhetoric throughout the book, right? It's very cleverly done in that sort of sense, positioning themselves as being, we're telling you the truth. We're giving you something that is unvarnished, that is not just rhetorical wordplay. And it's those bad guys over there, those nasty French philosophers who are selling you like all of these empty words that mean actually nothing and that they are misleading you with. They replay this trick at the same time. Of course, just like Socrates does, he, of course, using rhetoric, and he's using his wordplay, and he's using his trickery at the same time as using his allegories. Whenever all else fails, resort to allegory. And so I guess that's kind of what I found interesting in this chapter was this is kind of the next iteration of the discourse, the university discourse, where now the master signifier is what slides under the bar in the bottom left-hand corner. That's part of what I was trying to call the neutrality of objective science, right? That now mastery is what is being concealed and what has to be, I don't know if you would say repressed.
Obfuscated,
dissimulated, something like that. So
like the effects of power are sort of like they made deniable. They're like, well, we didn't do that. It was the experiment that made us do that.
Right.
The system did this. We have no responsibility for what happened.
Right.
So yeah, there's that kind of plausible deniability that is built into the university system that nonetheless hides the actual mechanisms of power. Yeah. Now,
one of the arguments I was trying to glean throughout the book, I know this is in another chapter, and I'm trying to just articulate the thought process here. Since you were talking about Socrates, that sort of early Lacan seems to either identify with Socrates or vibe with him, so to speak. And it's later Lacan that perhaps moves towards this understanding of the position of Plato as kind of the puppet master, if you will, of Socrates. And I'm wondering, is this part of Lacan's engagement with the movement of mastery from an ancient setting and discourse and scenario to a more modern one, where now, as we said, the French Revolution and sort of the fall of blatant power now power finds new means of becoming rational, so to speak. Is that then the university discourse is more of a modern form of mastery and clothing the emperor, so to speak?
Yeah, I think you're talking about the last chapter where I used the work of Oliver Harris, who wrote a great book on Lacan's relationship with classical thought. And Harris talks about the way, he's talking more about the way in which Lacan early in his career tends to identify with Socrates because he's very sort of anti-institutional, right? He doesn't want to have like the International Psychoanalytic Association like telling him what to do, and then he wants to found his own school, right? But then Harris notes the way in which he increasingly comes to identify more with Plato, who of course has found his academy, right? And so when Lacan has his own school, he gradually stops like seeing himself as the outsider, the lone wolf, the guy who stands up to the institution, and he becomes, of course, the head of the École Freudienne. Right. So there is this subtle shift that Oliver Harris notes in his book, in the way in which, as Lacan's position changes with regard to the institution, so too does his identification shift from Socrates to Plato. And nonetheless, what is interesting about that is, of course, part of what is central to Plato's style is his irony. And so one of the things that comes out more and more, Harris also notes, is the way in which Lacan has a kind of deliberately ironic distance from himself as a leader of the École Freudienne. Right, he sort of like wants to play the role. He wants to dress up as a kind of sort of like the king of psychoanalysis in one sense, but at the same time, kind of mock that sort of position. This is really central to what I say about Lacan in the book, is that he wants to be both those things. He wants to be master, and he also wants to mock the master and undermine that. And I don't know, it's especially reading about Lacan's sort of celebrity status at his seminars, especially in the 70s, because after the publication of Écrit and after May 68, he became this sort of celebrity that he wasn't before then. So it was sort of only sort of insiders and truly interested parties who went to his seminars before that time. But by the time you go to the 70s, it's going to like a rock concert or something. He is the star, and people are coming out there, and he's this central sort of figure, the celebrity figure, and he both seems to love it and loathe it at the same time.
Right. I was just thinking about, you quote Seminar 20 when one of the sessions begins and he says, I had a dream where I came to the lecture hall today and it was completely empty. And he says, this tells us something about wish fulfillment, right?
Yes. Yes. There's a lot of like that kind of grim irony. I certainly, when I was first reading Lacan, I never caught that kind of thing. But when rereading him for this project, I was like, oh my goodness. Like there's a lot of comments like that across the seminars where he's very sort of, he's almost, dismissive and rude towards his audience. He's sort of like, he's like, you guys don't understand this, or you guys won't appreciate this. This is way over your heads. And they're just like, right down.
I mean, you see this, you see, I don't know if it's directly at seminar 1, but I do recall in seminars 2 and 3, even that early on, he says some at least subtly disparaging remarks.
Yeah.
There's video on YouTube of, it's not a seminar, but it's a talk that Lacan gives. And I don't even know for sure what year it is, but the title is something like, there's like a situationist that disrupts the meeting. Comes up to Lacan, like there's a central desk or whatever, and pours water on Lacan's papers, and Lacan kind of lets him talk. But earlier on in the video, it's funny, you can kind of see Lacan has this sort of very elaborate, I don't know, it's sort of this tie thing, lapel thing on his shirt that's very extravagant, and just the way that he works the room, you know what I mean? And he even down to his movements are very much like this, you know what I mean? Someone who understands theatricality, I think.
Yeah.
Extensively.
I haven't seen the video, but I've seen you share some of the screenshots.
Right. Yeah. I share those screenshots all the time.
Yeah. I wouldn't put it past him to have scripted that either.
That's another quick little anecdote, if I may squeeze this in. So I thought it was very, since you had mentioned Plato not long ago in the chat, about how Lacan sort of says that Plato is already Lacanian. I've had a running joke for a long time, and I had no idea that this was even a thing until I read the book. But I've always had this joke about how Plato got the idea for the philosopher king from Lacan, and sort of this Hegelian or like templexical sort of fashion, as he sort of has this vision or something of Lacan and says, "Okay, that's the figure."
It's interesting though, because that means that Plato would have fundamentally misrecognized and misunderstood Lacan if that were to happen, because Plato is precisely, he even tried, at least as far as we are told, to convince the king of Syracuse to adopt his ideas. And I think that the interesting thing is, the reason why it doesn't work is that the Masters Discourse shows that it doesn't need knowledge. Right. It doesn't need to concern itself with knowledge. It doesn't need to justify itself philosophically. Right. That's perhaps more of the university discourse. But Peter, I'll let you chime in if you think I'm kind of correct in that sense.
Two things. First of all, I think Cooper, the quote you're talking about, I can't find it right now, but is by Badiou.
Yes.
It's from Badiou, actually says that, where he says basically this kind of semi-serious joke that Plato was, there.
Oh yeah,
there it is.
From Badiou.
So in Badiou, in his conversation with Rudinesco, says, what does he say? That I'll read it aloud. It says,
yes,
we've seen how he is able to argue, not without humor, that Plato was already Lacanian. Right? And so, of course, we can see that Badiou is not taking this entirely seriously, right? He's sort of realizing that Lacan is kind of making a joke about like how he, in the same way that Nancy and Lecoulbat rather more seriously talk about the way in which Lacan plugs in his ideas into earlier thinkers and uses them as if they all exist on the same sort of plane of thought. But there is actually, I think it's in Seminar 7, where he, just to go back to what you were saying, Taylor, about the difference between the ancient and the moderns, where he actually says, I don't think that Plato would understand psychoanalysis, right? And he says this because he says that ancient thinkers like Plato and Aristotle existed in a context where mastery was restricted to those who were above slaves, right? And because they had this built-in hierarchy within their society as a conceptual thing, right, as well as a structural thing, that they would not have been able to understand psychoanalysis as a modern kind of discourse. So he specifically locates psychoanalysis as being something that has come after the sort of like the idea, the Enlightenment idea of universal equality.
Right.
So there are different ways of relating Lacan to Plato. And as I said, Oliver Harris does this wonderful job of like looking at the way in which he has this sort of ironic institutional ambiguity about Plato as the head of academy, but also wanting to be at the same time Socrates outside of the system. And then, like as you mentioned, like the ancient versus the modern, he's also thinking about it in this way. So the Badiou quote that you referring to, Cooper, I think we always have to keep that with take that with a grain of salt, because he's definitely at least half serious and at least half joking. Yeah.
I just thought it was funny. It was a funny coincidence, since I kind of made that. I haven't read that book, so it was an interesting little coincidence.
Have either of you read that Badiou Rudinesco book, where they have basically they sit down, it's like 30 years after Lacan's death, right? And they're basically having a sort of like a fanboy chat about what they remember about him and what they like about him and what he contributed, and and then they typed up the transcript and published it as a small little book.
That sounds great.
What's the title of that book? I have the Rudinesco biography, but I haven't read it yet. But I'd be interested to read this as well, if you happen to remember it. It's
called Jacques Lacan, Past and Present.
Okay, I'll add it to the list. It does sound fascinating. I do recall some of Badiou's other works where he elaborates on this notion of anti-philosophy and Lacan being an anti-philosopher. So I would like to see that. And, in preparation for our discussion today, I also read Fink's, I think it's 1998, his essay on the discourses, right, on the master signifier. It's one of the works that you cite. And I remember in a footnote, he says something about he says that the Rudinesco biography amounts to nothing more than slander, which for two reasons I wanted to know why he might say that. And the other thing, I thought it was an interesting slip, because he obviously means libel, right? Because slander is spoken and libel is written. So it's an interesting little analyst slip from Fink. But do you have any idea? Do you remember that footnote in your review of all the literature, or do you have any idea if Fink elaborates on that notion elsewhere? And if not, then I just thought it was an interesting thing to note since Cooper brought up her biography of Lacan, obviously.
One of the things I didn't know when I started this project was just how deep the divisions run both within the Lacanians and like between the Lacanians and the anti-Lacanians. Basically, there seems to be like there are no or very few positions in between, right? There's very few. You either love Lacan or you hate Lacan. You either embrace this Lacan or you embrace that Lacan, and like any other interpretation you have to hate. So I found this a very strange thing when I was reading, because honestly I found things that I gained a lot of benefit from pretty much all the positions. Maybe not so much the anti-Lacanian ones like Talus but certainly from reading the anti-Lacanian figures, Bork Jacobson, and particularly Roustan, I think was a fascinating experience, because he really does identify some fascinating contradictions within psychoanalysis and within Lacan. But I think what you're seeing there with Fink and Rudinesco is there's a kind of a turf fight.
Yes, okay, I see.
Between those Lacanians who follow more the later Lacan compared to the early and middle Lacan, and also those who follow Jacques-Alain Miller versus those who do not.
I see. So, yes.
Makes sense.
So Rudinesco is very much on the anti-Miller side. Right. And I think Fink is much more on his side, even though they both, I think for me, both Fink and Rudinesco are much more early to middle Lacan thinkers.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I find Fink very useful in explaining the imaginary and the symbolic, but when it comes to trying to explain the real, I think he kind of is very weak in that area.
He's found lacking, right?
Yes, he's found lacking, yes.
So unless there's anything else we want to say about Sokal and Bricmont, I mean, it's probably been said before, Cooper.
I did want to mention just briefly that I forget you mentioned the Dawkins article or review of.
Yeah.
Okay. So I believe that was published in Scientific American. It was.
I think was it not just the journal Science?
Or maybe it was the
Hold
journal.
on. Let me see. I've got it.
But, I think it's fairly clear that he didn't engage with the thought whatsoever and is basically kind of parroting the Sokal and Bricmont book.
It's in the journal Nature. Sorry.
Nature.
Yeah, yep. So he gives it's a big journal, right? The way that they try to pass it off is as if he's actually engaged with Lacan's work, and
very doubtful.
Right, and the other French sort of thinkers. I don't know. It's very, very dubious for Dawkins. I have a friend that actually just made a video about this whole controversy, and as well as Chomsky's contributions. They thank Chomsky directly as someone who contributed to the project. There was another thinker that I can't. It was Bourdieu. Pierre Bourdieu also was someone that they Sokal and Bricmont thank as part of the book.
That's interesting.
Yeah, exactly. I found that quite interesting given Bourdieu's proximity to Baudrillard. But anyways,
well, perhaps he's representing the social sciences and trying to keep them out of the line of fire.
Yeah, right. Perhaps. I just wanted to mention that briefly.
One of my favorite parts of my book is actually the end of that chapter, because I thought I haven't seen enough people talk about seriously about what Lacan's relationship to mathematics is. What is this fascination that he has? Like a lot of the people who are talking about the Mathews were sort of, well, he seems to have started a project and then he didn't really finish it, or he started this project of trying to create a formal language of psychoanalysis, but it basically disappeared up its own butt. It became so complicated and so complex that you might as well dismiss it. Whereas I think, as I put it here with the engagement with Bourdieu, is that what he sees in mathematics is that it's fascinating to him, as I put it here. Mathematics is fascinating to him precisely because it is authoritative. Its equations have an irrefutable power, a power that is grounded in rational logic, and yet the power of that rationality can itself be explained. Right. So 2 + 2 = 4. And we can all see that that's it's something that is rational, but we also can't explain why it's rational. Right. And I think this is something that Lacan is very interested in. right? Is like, how do you then create a discourse? How then do you create a politics? How then do you create a philosophy that is centered around this apparent paradox?
Right.
Like, how do you create something that is both irrational and yet has a power to it at the same time, which of course is what he's claiming the university discourse is masquerading as, right? It's masquerading as rationality, but actually operating as a tool of power. But he wanting to actually create a genuine rational power, right? Marriage of those two things. And that's what I think he aspired to do, but I don't think Lacan ever succeeded in doing that.
And I also think that you point out, and you may be quoting someone, but this notion that the matheme ideally is able to transmit information absolutely without loss. Is this also a part of it, the irrefutable power, as you put it, in terms of this? I guess that was what I always assumed, because as you said, a lot of the times when the Lacan and mathematics is brought up, it's usually dismissive or superficial, and you do go deep into it, especially dealing with Descartes and obviously bringing up Badiou. But I had always just assumed that it was this way of the formulas are ways of capturing and transmitting without information loss.
That's one of the interpretations by some of his critics.
Okay.
And I think maybe Roustan maybe thinks closer to that idea, that he thinks that's what Lacan is trying to do. Mm-hmm. But I don't see it as, it's never directly signaled that way by Lacan himself, as far as I can tell. Yeah.
Taylor, this actually might be more something you might be able to answer, but I'm just kind of curious, what relationship do the mathemes have to something like Guattari's diagrammatics?
Well, I mean,
I almost feel like there's got to be there's got to be sort of, maybe I'm being too linear with my ideas.
No, I mean, I do think they obviously share similarities, and there's no doubt that Guattari gains inspiration from, because Lacan also has diagrams throughout his work, as you know. And I guess the only way I would distinguish them is that the formulas are algebraic, at least in that sense, have a mathematical aspect to them in terms of their symbolization. But you see that Guattari's diagrams, there's some extra layers added to it, specifically the use of language that isn't stripped of its formal qualities, or is it stripped down to its formal qualities?
Gotcha.
Peter, would you kind of agree with that?
I don't know anything about Guattari's diagrammatics, so I can't speak to that. But I honestly don't know what Lacan was trying to do with his mathemes. I've read them all. I've read all the critics talking about them. But I still don't really know what the mathemes themselves were really attempting to do. I mean, for me, the only formula that really have any sort of profound interest and meaning are the four discourses. Mm-hmm. Because I sat down and I was able to work out what each formula actually means and how it expresses a different relationship to power, right? And the way, I mean, obviously, particularly the discourse of mastery and the discourse of the hysteric and the discourse of the university are the central ones. And so those three formula, they express something meaningful to me. But someone like, the L schema and all those sorts of things. I know Zizek always likes to quote the formula of fantasy. Mm-hmm. That one is one of his favorites. But honestly, apart from the four discourses, I don't genuinely see anything all that interesting about them.
I would have to tend to agree with that. But that could be, again, my lack of understanding those diagrams out of context.
In seminar 19, which is where he talks a lot about Frege and the one and the that is not one. But basically, this is his sort of formal, logical, mathematical attempt to basically just restate the subject who is supposed to know in these sort of mathematical terms. So basically, there never is a one because, basically it's a fantasy projected in the same way that the subject who is supposed to know is projected. So as I said, I understand what he's doing, and I can see why he's sort of excited to see in someone like Frege that there are parallels with his way of thinking that he then tries to appropriate. But I can't see it doing something new. I can see something new in the four discourses, in the way it collapses into a kind of monism. But I can't see anything new in the other examples that he gives. So,
and what's fascinating about the formula is that each time we we shift, we have the quarter turn, right? We have a clockwise quarter turning of each symbol. And there's a kind of elegance. I mean, you could say even mathematicians should have seen that kind of elegance in the, as you said, in this collapsing, in kind of a minimalism. But I think it's Kashkarian again, who it was very scathing and says that if Sokal and Brickman don't intend to discuss what is psychoanalytic about Lacan's writing, then you kind of lose everything.
Yes.
Right. If you're only talking about him in terms of mathematics, qua mathematics, you're missing the whole thing.
Yeah. I love that quote. It's so sharply pointed. He says, I found the quote, it's on page 81.
Okay.
He says, Sokal and Brickman's book, he points out, shows that a half a dozen pages in Lacan make no sense from a mathematical point of view, whereas what one wants to know is whether they make sense from a psychoanalytic point of view.
Yeah.
Or conversely, since our authors promise they will, quote, not enter into debate on the properly psychoanalytic part of Lacan's work, and that part of his work is, well, all of it.
I think that's great. That kind of summarizes why perhaps you said that they are either the least charitable or have the least ground from which to say anything at all about Lacan.
Yeah. I think we were talking about this before we started recording was, Dylan Evans and Stuart Schneiderman have the background, right? They have the tools, they've done the reading, right? They know their Lacan, but both of them fail to or refuse or what I honestly don't really fully understand their motivations in not providing at least some kind of genuine critique. I see the limitations of Nancy and Le Coulabart, of Mikkel Borg-Jacobsen, of Francois Roustan. Right? I see their limitations, but I don't see any in Evans and in Schneiderman. I don't see any attempt at critique. It's just, this is nonsense. I was tricked into following it, and now my eyes have been opened. The scales have fallen off my eyes on my road to Damascus.
Right.
And now I've been converted to, whether it's scientism in the case of Evans, or like I'm now a kind of right-wing life coach in the case of Schneiderman.
The very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is the whole state of things, a pure violence without option anymore. This is a typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.